How's it going, guys? Hank here, back at it again with another video on the Review and Preview Sports YouTube channel. And folks, as always, I'd like to give you guys a friendly neighborhood reminder. Please don't forget to follow us on all of our social medias. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Review Preview Sports. And of course, please don't forget to hit that big red button down below. Give us a like, give us a comment, let us know your thoughts. We want to hear from you guys. And so for this video, we are going to be discussing the World Series and breaking down the matchup between the Houston Astros and the Philadelphia Phillies. The series, of course, will be starting tomorrow night in Houston. I am looking forward to watching the series. Very interesting matchup we've got here, and definitely a good amount of storylines. And, you know, the two teams that are playing against each other could not have had a more opposite path in getting to the World Series than the Astros and Phillies. But let's start off by talking about the Houston Astros. Now, I don't think anybody is really surprised that this team is back in the World Series. It is now the second consecutive year in which they are representing the American League, and it is also their fourth trip to the World Series in the last 6 years. And fun fact, not too many teams in the divisional era have pulled off that feat. The only ones, obviously the New York Yankees did that in the late 90s. The Atlanta Braves did that as well during the 1990s. And of course, the only other one I could think of, actually, no, the Cincinnati Reds just missed out on that cut. I'm talking, of course, about the Big Red Machine. But either way, that is some very elite company that we're talking about with regards to teams that have made the World Series 4 times in 6 years. Now, granted, the Houston Astros also have a bit of a checkered reputation, checkered past, and I think that's putting it mildly because, unless you're living under a rock, you pretty much know that the Houston Astros are still being maligned and backlashed and shamed because of all the World Series cheating that went on during the 2017 season. But with that being said, regardless of how you feel about the Houston Astros, this is a team that is extremely well built and very fundamentally sound. And, it's really no shock that they are here whatsoever. I mean, let's look at that lineup. I mean, it is extremely deep. I mean, to give you an idea of how deep they are, Yordan Alvarez, Kyle Tucker, and Jose Altuve all went cold during the ALCS. Neither of them really contributed much. Yet you still got production out of guys such as Alex Bregman, Yuli Gurriel, Chas McCormick, who hit 2 home runs in the ALCS against the Yankees, including one big one in Game 3. And then, of course, you had Jeremy Pena, who led the Astros in batting average during the NLCS and earned himself the MVP award, especially with his big 3-run home run in Game 4 to conclude the sweep. And the Astros are also now the 4th team to run the table on their way to a pennant. The only other ones to do so, the 76 Reds, who completely swept and demolished both the Philadelphia Phillies and the New York Yankees in 76. They went 7-0. The Colorado Rockies in 07 during their surprise run went 7-0 before they eventually got swept themselves by the Boston Red Sox. And then, of course, that you have the 2014 Kansas City Royals, who have the longest such winning streak in one postseason at 8 games. They are, of course, I believe, they're of course just ahead of the Colorado Rockies, who technically one of their wins would have been a playoff win if it wasn't a game 163. But I digress. It's a very impressive streak by the Houston Astros. And the surprising part is, in the games that they swept getting to the World Series, they didn't really dominate. I mean, you had that big comeback in Game 1 against Seattle with Yordan Alvarez hitting that walk-off home run in the bottom of the 9th to set the tone. And that really essentially changed the series. And then you had another close win in Game 2. And then, of course, Jeremy Pena hitting the go-ahead home run in the 18th inning of Game 3 against Seattle, one of the longest games ever in postseason history. And then, of course, you had the Yankees series where the Yankees, unfortunately, could not get anything going, and the Astros, as a result, edged them out in some pretty close games. Games 1, 2, and 4 really were all back pretty much nail biters. And then you had game 3 where the Yankees just could not hit. I believe it was Christian Vasquez. I believe it was Christian Javier who started that game. So not a great showing for the Yankees, whose entire lineup essentially did not show up. But the Astros, as I said, got clutch hits from more than their stars and some other supporting players. So well-deserved. Not surprised that they're here. And some other key strength from them besides their starting rotation and their lineup is their defense ranked among the highest in Major League Baseball. And of course, not to mention, there's the bullpen. And in the postseason as a whole, they have only allowed a combined total of 2 runs. This is all in appearances from Brian Abreu, Hunter Brown, Louis Garcia, Rafael Montero, Hector Neris, Ryan Presley, and Ryan Stanek. So it's an absolute lockdown job by the Astros. And if we were to look at this matchup on paper of the World Series, the Phillies shouldn't necessarily have a chance in beating the Astros based on how dominant they are from top to bottom. But, let's get right into the Phillies. The Phillies lineup itself really isn't too shabby. You had JT Realmuto, the starting catcher who hit the first ever inside the park home run for a catcher during the postseason. That was during their series win against defending world champions Atlanta Braves. You also have Nick Castellanos, Kyle Schwarber, who's been one of the biggest power hitters in baseball. In fact, he also has the most home runs on the season for a player not named Aaron Judge. And in addition to that, you also have Rhys Hoskins, Gene Segura, who, while not necessarily a power hitter, he's still been providing some good contact hits. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Bryce Harper, who is really having his first big postseason of his career. He ended up winning the NLCS MVP, had that big home run in Game 5 in Philadelphia, setting off an absolute frenzy. And their path to getting there, definitely a surprise, because as I mentioned, they beat the defending World Series champion Atlanta Braves in 4 games. Then they go on to beat another Cinderella team in the San Diego Padres, absolutely mutilating them in 5. And I think the question is, do the Phillies even have a shot at keeping up with the Astros in the World Series? And, I think one key for the Phillies is their starting pitching, particularly the top 2 guys in the rotation. Now, the media pretty much, and the whole narrative about the Phillies is that they're this big underdog, like this little engine that could team that's like such a surprising story. But if you really look at that roster, I don't think it's necessarily surprising, because as I told you about the lineup before, and then you get to the starting rotation, you have Zach Wheeler and Aaron Nola at the top 2. Both of them should be starting the first 2 games in the World Series. I believe Nola will be starting tomorrow night against Justin Verlander. And then Zach Wheeler, who you could argue may be the actual ace of that Philadelphia Phillies rotation. And I think one of the big keys for them would be for them to not so much take one game, but maybe both of them in Houston, because I think it'll really set a tone. But if they split, then it could get really dicey, because afterwards you have Noah Syndergaard, who wasn't quite as dominant as he was in years past with the New York Mets, and then Ranger Suarez emerged as a decent number 4 starter, who again, they're all solid. But when you really look at the pitching rotation side by side between the Astros and the Phillies, like the Phillies might have had like some of the hotter 1-2 punch, at least going into the postseason, but like the Astros seem to have the more complete rotation. Then I would argue the same thing with the bullpen. Their 8 and 9 guys, Jose Alvarado and then Sir Anthony Dominguez, have been absolutely lights out for them in the postseason. But afterwards, it gets kind of dicey. And I think the other big contrast between the Phillies and the Astros is the Phillies defensively were actually ranked among the worst teams in Major League Baseball. So I think that's another factor for why they're such a heavy underdog going into this series. But again, it'll be really interesting to see how the games play out. And, one of the things that really is interesting about this World Series is the Phillies and the Astros actually have a lot of connections with one another. In fact, I believe Game 1 will mark the anniversary of when the Phillies won that epic 5-game series against the Houston Astros back when they were a National League team in 1980. And that was a series that featured 4 extra inning games and only 1 home run, but 2 crazy comebacks by the Phillies in games 4 and 5 of that series. And then I think the real thing that's intriguing about this World Series matchup is the legacies and the storylines, because you look at the managers. Rob Thompson gets hired in early June after the Phillies get off to a slow start with Joe Girardi, and Rob Thompson seems to be a guy that the Phillies really love playing for. They kept on winning with him. They did not skip a beat after June, and while they did slump a little bit in September, they put things together and they absolutely dominated in getting to the postseason, and you got to tip your cap to him there. So it should be interesting to see how that storyline keeps going and if they can really keep the whole Cinderella thing going. I mean, and you really look at a lot of the Philly teams, most of them, the Phillies' history has had a lot of losing, but every now and then they'll have that one really good team that either comes out of nowhere or they'll get good seasons and spurts. And this season kind of has a 93-like feel for them, although I think the only difference is this year's Phillies team doesn't really have as many crazy, steroided, unlikable players, just as that team did. But I also think this year's Phillies team is more talented, and the bullpen's a little bit better. At least they don't have to deal with Mitch Wild Thing Williams this year. And then you have the Astros. Dusty Baker has been one of the best managers and most well-respected managers in baseball. The only manager to win a division with 5 different MLB teams. Besides the Astros, he won with San Francisco Giants, Cincinnati Reds, Chicago Cubs, and the Washington Nationals. But the one thing that has eluded him, despite so many years of success in the major leagues, is a World Series title. Now, granted, he obviously won one as an outfielder with the Los Angeles Dodgers in the early 80s, but I think this year a World Series title could really be a big feather in his cap. And I think it'll pretty much guarantee that he's going to get inducted into the Hall of Fame as soon as he retires. Although you can make the case that he's a Hall of Famer already. And then you look at some of the other stars on that team. You got Jose Altuve, Alex Bregman, and Justin Verlander. 2 of the guys are the ones that have been much maligned after the cheating scandal, but then Justin Verlander is one of the greatest pitchers in baseball, probably the best pitcher of my era. Another World Series title could further cement his place in Cooperstown, although I think his legacy is essentially all for good. But the fact that he had such an amazing year after a comeback from Tommy John surgery in his late 30s is nothing short of incredible, and it would be definitely good for those guys if they won the World Series. And then you look at the Phillies, another guy I didn't mention, Bryce Harper, who's been one of the best players in Major League Baseball. I think he gets that World Series title. Then I think you could really start to make the case that he could end up finding himself into the Hall of Fame once his career is all said and done. But those are legacy talks that we'll probably hear more about after the World Series ends. But to me, those are always the things that fascinate me more than anything else when it comes to World Series matchups. But before I end this video, I'd like to give a little bit of a preview or a prediction for the World Series. So I think it should be closer than people think. I think even though the Astros, on paper, are the far better team, at least roster-wise, I think the Phillies should definitely give them a good fight for it. I think they'll probably steal a game or 2. Most likely they'll win a game at their own home ballpark. But at the end of the day, despite all the feel-good story, despite the fact that the Phillies probably won't have as much pressure on them, I just think this year is going to be the Astros' time. I think this is the year where the Astros really silence all the doubters and all the critics that are illegitimizing their World Series, maybe a little bit myself included to an extent. And I think they win the World Series in 6. I think Dusty Baker finally gets his first World Series title. And I think in the end, a good amount of those guys who were there for both teams that won the title, you'll probably in later years hear about them getting their numbers retired and a place in the Houston Astros Hall of Fame. And yeah, should definitely be interesting. But that's really all I have to talk about the World Series right now. And before I sign off, as always, I'd like to give you guys a friendly neighborhood reminder. Please don't forget to follow us on all of our social medias. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Review and Preview Sports. And of course, please don't forget to hit that big red button down below. Give us a like, give us a comment, let us know your thoughts, and please tell me, Who do you think will win the World Series? Do you think the Phillies have a shot at upsetting the Astros? Do you think this is the Astros' time to shine, and the Astros will finally get that elusive second title in that span that I've been talking about? Whose legacy do you think will be improved after the World Series? And yeah, I'd love to hear all your thoughts. We'd love to interact with you guys in the comment section on the YouTube page. But that is all I have for you today. Until next time, I'm Hank and Dicker, and I will see you guys later.